Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Solar PV and Batteries Eco Homes event. This is organised by Transition Chesterfield. My name's Lisa. I'm from Transition Chesterfield, and I'm going to be chairing tonight's event. And this event is also supported by Derbyshire Climate Coalition, Derby Climate Coalition, Northeast Climate Climate Action Northeast Derbyshire and Marches Energy Agency. And this is the third Eco Homes event this month, and the other two on insulation and heat pumps. If you didn't go to those, we will be putting the recordings of those on our website, and those were organised by Wirksworth Community Land Trust and Hope Valley Climate Action, other Derbyshire environmental groups. So tonight we're going to have presentations by first by John Beardmore of T4 Sustainability, and then we're going to hear from three Derbyshire homeowners, Kevin, Tracy and Peter. And then we're going to have a quick update by another Peter from Marches Energy Agency on their retrofit project. And then we're going to open it up to questions and answers. And at that point, I'll ask you to raise your hands using the reactions button if you can, because with so many of you, I can't see everybody. So I'll ask you to use the reactions. But if you do want to put questions or comments in the chat, you're very welcome. But it's helpful for the recording afterwards if people can actually verbally ask their question when we get to it. So without further ado, a big welcome to, and thanks very much to John Beardmore from T4 Sustainability. John, if you'd like to unmute and share your screen, and you can start your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I hope you can all hear me now.
Yes, we can see your slides.
So I guess we're primarily looking here at electricity production and storage, but also some of the ways that you can use sort of excess energy, heating up water with immersion diverters, interactions with heat pumps and electric vehicles, and selling into the grid. And I will also very briefly at the end mention solar thermal, which going back to 2005 or thereabouts was the only game in town, which nobody really thinks about very much these days, but in some circumstances it's still worth considering. So the basic parts of a PV system are the panels themselves on the roof, the bit you can see. Somewhere, usually in the house or in the garage, sometimes on the outside wall, you've got an inverter, and that just takes the DC energy from the solar panels and makes it into AC electricity that you can use to run appliances or put into the grid. The inverter is usually connected via your consumer unit or fuse box, as we used to call them. And sometimes if your existing consumer unit or fuse box is full or obsolete, you might need to add a small second box, basically to give you a safe way of connecting. The electricity meter will normally monitor the amount of energy that's exported. If you've got a smart meter, that will also possibly be relevant, but you'll have to have some sort of metering for your exports these days. In the old days, when we had the feed-in tariff, you would have a meter which measured what you generated, and you get paid for everything you generated, regardless of whether you used it. But these days, the smart export guarantee, as the name implies, is based on what you can export. So one of the questions we keep getting asked is why PV instead of wind power? And I won't say very much about wind, except that it's difficult from a planning point of view. Most people live in areas where there isn't very much wind. Wind near houses tends to be very turbulent. Turbulence shortens the life and reduces the efficiency of wind turbines. They can be quite noisy, and that noise can be coupled as vibration into the building, so that can be a problem. The vibration can also sort of crack mortar and things, so it's not an ideal thing as a bolt-on to a domestic house. And the yield can also be very low. Back in about 2005, there was a project called Warwick Wind Trials, and I think they worked out on average a turbine, which in those days you could buy from places like B&Q, generated enough energy on average for half a low energy light bulb. So that was an average of about 4 or 5 watts. So yeah, wind is, I think, a difficult technology on sort of domestic buildings. So this is a fairly typical PV system. Don't feel you've got to have an enormous amount of roof. This one slots in a couple of rows of panels just above an enormous sort of bedroom that's on the top floor of the building. You could possibly get a few more panels in on the ground or whatever, but this is still giving you about a 2.5 kilowatt system. This one I think was installed about 2013, and it's still going strong without any maintenance to speak of. We check what it's producing from time to time, but it just chugs along. In recent times we have added a battery, and that's been a useful improvement. There are quite a few ways of mounting panels, but broadly speaking they fall into two camps. There's mounting them on rails above the tiles of a roof, and for most people this is probably the most cost-effective way of doing it. But the other approach is to recess them into the roof, and I guess particularly if you're sort of building from scratch, if you do it this way, you don't need to buy as many roof tiles. And if the colour of the panels and the surround on the panels matches darker coloured roof tiles, it can blend in, sort of aesthetically speaking, quite well. Doesn't work quite so well on this roof because the roof tiles are fairly sort of red, but can be quite an appealing way of doing it. I've just labelled this how not to do it. It's always more cost effective if you can to have a big area of roof with all the panels in one place. That's what we were expecting when we came to do this installation, and then we found that during the job somebody had decided to put roof lights in, and that meant that we could get far fewer panels on. So the cost comes down a little bit because of the reduced number of panels, but you still need scaffolding and all the things for access. So it makes the job far less cost effective. So where you can, go for big areas of panels with everything in the same place. I've just included this slide. This is a Fronius inverter. It's thoroughly obsolete, but it makes the point that solar is quite a long-lived technology. Normally we explain to people that an inverter will probably last about 10 years. We've tended to use fairly high quality ones. The Fronius models are pretty high end. We didn't actually install this one, but we were called out because we were told the system had stopped working. With a 17-year-old inverter, you tend to assume it'll be that. In the end, it turned out that the failure was the electricity meter, and the inverter is still absolutely fine. So yeah, that's good news. This is a more modern inverter. There are actually two in this picture. One of them is basically the PV inverter, so that's just DC for the panels to AC mains. The other one connects to a battery, which is the black box you can see on the floor. You don't have to have two separate boxes. You can integrate them into one. There are pros and cons to both approaches, but be aware that it's an option to have a separate inverter charger for the battery. And if you've got an existing inverter that works well and isn't desperately old, you may well want to do that just so as not to have to throw away the old inverter. I dare say you've all heard of Tesla. This is one of the Tesla Powerwall 2 batteries. The small white box on the left of the Tesla large box is the gateway. Most battery systems can't run the house during power cuts. As soon as the power goes off, they'll stop generating. With the Tesla system, the gateway isolates the house during power cuts, and then you can run the house with the grid off. The small white box on the right is the PV inverter. And note, none of these things have got displays on the front panel. The trend these days is very much towards linking the things to the internet and having an app to interface to them. These are the Tesla units at night. They have a rather fetching green strip down the side. Whether you regard that as attracting burglars or an aesthetic benefit is up to you. Okay, so if you've got a battery system, the graph above is how things will typically play out on a summer day. So the top graph shows the sort of orange area is energy coming out of the battery. The green area is energy which is used directly from the PV system. The sort of generation stops about 8 o'clock in the evening, and that basically is where the battery takes over again. The bottom graph shows you green is the energy that's used directly, so you can see there's a bit of that all day long. The orange is power that's used to charge the battery, And the yellow, once the battery is charged, is any any surplus energy which gets exported to the grid. Okay, so this graph is showing top half is the energy that's being used or consumed. The green shows day by day as you go through the month the energy that's used directly. The orange is the energy that's come through the battery. So you can see from this graph that the amount of energy that you're using from your PV system is virtually doubled by having the battery. The little red bits are the energy that you have to buy when you sort of run out of battery power, or when the battery is a bit slow to respond to a change of load. The bottom graph shows generation and what happens to the generated energy. So again, green is what you've used directly. In this case, the orange is what's been used to charge the battery, and the yellow is what's been exported into the grid once the battery is being charged. Now, there's always a question about whether you can find a use for that energy which you would otherwise export. And if you do try and find other uses for that energy, you need to think about how the various devices that you might use will interoperate. So if you're going to get a battery system, you've got to think about the capacity of the battery. So that's the amount of energy that's stored in kilowatt hours. But you also need to think about how rapidly it can charge and discharge. So let's imagine, for example, you have a large domestic 6 kilowatt PV system. If your batteries can only charge at 2 or 2.5 kilowatts, if the sun's out, a lot of the energy is still going to go into the grid because you can't charge the battery fast enough. But similarly, if you've got an electric cooker, that can easily use more than 2.5 kilowatts. So you'd find that you were buying electricity even if your battery was fairly full. And similarly, if you had an electric car or charged if you were charging an electric car or ran an electric shower. Operating temperature, performance and fire risk are also worth thinking about. We've always discouraged people from putting batteries in attics. Batteries, when all said and done, are a nasty soup of chemicals, and the last thing you want to do, as every child with a chemistry set knows, is heat up that mixture. So if you can keep batteries in a relatively cool part of the house, that will be good. Lithium-ion battery fires are really quite rare, but when they can happen, or if they do happen, they can be very severe. So I wouldn't, for example, want to put batteries under the stairs if the stairs are the only way of getting out of the house during a fire. One of the nice things about the Tesla batteries and some of the other makes is you can put them on the outside of the house and just screw them to the outside of a wall. And that significantly reduces the risk that they pose if you do have a fire or something like that. You also want to think about how long a battery system will last. So I think the lifetime, I think these days, most batteries will probably come with at least a 5, but more likely a 10 or possibly longer warranty. I think Give Energy is about 12 years at the moment. Now, the battery manufacturers certainly won't be expecting them to fail within their sort of warranty period. So that implies that they're probably expecting them to last into the teens of years. The lifetime sort of energy throughput is another indicator that you might want to look at. And that's quite a little bit of a difficult one to get your head around. During its life, a battery system will store a certain number of megawatt hours of energy. But obviously a big battery will store more megawatt hours of energy over its life than a small one. So the metric for that is megawatt hours per kilowatt hour of battery capacity. So that's a question that it's worth asking any battery supplier. A lot of them will say that they don't have the information, but it's a good sign if they do, that they can sort of have a reasonable product if they're willing to discuss that number. Another thing you can usefully do with the surplus energy is divert it into heating hot water. The gadgets for doing that are called immersion diverters. The little white box above the hot water cylinder here is the diverter, and you can see that's got one wire which comes from the power supply and one which goes off to the immersion heater. It's a fairly simple device, but it needs to know how much energy is being exported from the building, and it uses that information to work out how much to divert into the hot water cylinder. and it'll go on increasing the amount of energy that goes into the hot water cylinder until your net export is zero. I put in a picture of heat pumps here. Heat pumps don't, generally speaking, have any smart way of interacting with solar panels yet, although it would be an obvious feature for the manufacturers to add. A lot of people will probably try and sell you PV systems and heat pumps together. And in spring and autumn, having a PV system will certainly help to run the heat pump if you're running the heat pump during the day, which you may not be. What I suppose I would say is the time of year you're most likely to be using the heat pump is winter, and in winter you're going to get the least energy output from the PV system. Most PV systems struggle to meet people's ordinary needs without any heating at all during the middle of winter, and really they will make very little contribution to running a heat pump in November, December, January, February. This graph here just shows if you just look at the top part of it, you've got the green energy, which is the energy available from PV. The yellow or orange is the energy that's come through the battery, and the red is what you've purchased. So this is a house with a heat pump, and you can see that during the summer when the heat pump's not on, nearly all the energy is coming through the battery and directly from the PV system. But once you get into October, you're starting to buy energy in serious quantities, and by the time you get to November, the vast majority of the energy is going into the heat pump and it's being purchased from the grid rather than coming through the heat pump and battery, through the PV system and battery. So yeah, just bear in mind that the proportion of energy that you'll get from PV in winter, if you've got a heat pump, is fairly small. We touched up briefly on electric car charging. Electric car chargers, again, pretty straightforward bit of equipment, but some of the smarter ones will have the usual fast charge and slow charge modes. So they'll charge at, say, 7 kilowatts and 2 kilowatts, but they'll have an additional mode, and that will enable you to charge with the energy that you would otherwise export. There's a little bit of a sting in the tail with that, in that the regulations specify a minimum charge rate of about 1.6 kilowatts. So to get a useful amount of charging done with these things, you need to have an array of PV panels on the roof, which will give you more than 1.6 kilowatts for a significant amount of the time. So watch out for that. So common PV problems, squirrels, they can chew through cables and that can shut systems down. Pigeons can nest under the panels, which may not do very much harm, but it can be quite noisy with them scrabbling around on the roof. The one part of a PV system which is most failure prone is probably the connectors. The panels are joined together using MC4 connectors. And those MC4 connectors, if they're not assembled properly, can get a little bit of water ingress and fail after a while. So they need to be assembled with some care with the proper tools, and there's a bit of a knack to doing it. So yeah, hopefully your installers will do that properly. But if you get an electrical problem, there's a good chance that that'll be it. As I said earlier on, a lot of systems these days are only really accessed through apps. They don't have displays on the front panel. So network and internet problems are a possibility. We have had one university site where it was never possible to commission one type of battery because the network was so locked down and firewalled that we couldn't get that to work. And I think it took us some months on an industrial site, again, because of their sort of internet connectivity protection, that I think in the end it was probably a couple of months at least before we got that to work. The system would still generate, but they couldn't use the sort of manufacturer's portals and apps to measure what it was doing. Okay, guide prices. There are some figures here. The prices drift over time. These are not particularly up to date. They'll give you a sort of ballpark figure. So these are systems with PV only, no batteries, and yeah, sort of typically sort of 6,000 to 8,000 range for 3.4 to 5 kilowatts. So hybrid systems, so this is where you have one box which connects the PV panels, the grid and the battery. And you can see that jumps up to about 10 or 12,000 depending on the size of the system. Okay, so this is adding a battery to an existing system where there's already a PV inverter. So this is addition of a battery only, no PV, PV existing. And again, depending on the size of the battery, that can be sort of in the 3,000 or 3 to 4,000 up to 6 to 7,000 sort of range. We've also mentioned the Tesla Powerwall 2 here with the whole house backup. This says Powerwall 3 coming soon. I think the Powerwall 3 is now available and it's quite a good battery. What you think of Elon Musk is possibly another matter. Okay, I won't stop for questions now. We'll perhaps deal with that later. I did say I'd briefly mention solar thermal. Solar thermal circulates water through a panel on the roof and the water's heated up by the panel. The panel is just like a very thin radiator, so it's made of metal usually, although you can get plastic ones. Water warms up, circulates through a heat exchanger in your hot water cylinder and warms it up very directly. And you may think, well, why bother if you can do it all with PV? The simple answer is that PV at best is about 20% efficient in converting light into energy, and solar thermal can be about 60% efficient. So if you use a lot of hot water, this is worth giving serious consideration. The problem with solar thermal is that in winter you may not get enough water to get up. You may not get enough water up to bathing temperature for a bath or anything like that. On the other hand, in summer you may have bathing temperature water by about 11 o'clock in the morning, and then the system doesn't do anything else useful for the rest of the day. The nice thing about PV is that there are always other ways you can use the surplus energy, whereas with solar thermal, once you've got your cylinder of hot water, there's not much more you can do with it. Typical solar panels for thermal applications boil down to flat plate and evacuated tube. The evacuated tube type insulate the collectors much better, so they'll work on bright cold days rather better than flat plate. But which is best probably depends on the temperature of water you want to produce. So if it was a swimming pool or something like that, flat plate might be better. If it's for bathing temperature water, evacuated tube is generally better. That's what evacuated tubes actually look like. And you can see at the end of the sort of manifold at the top, there's an insulated pipe going in, and the evacuated tubes themselves just plug into the manifold up at the top. Now, I guess that's always the question, are you better off with PV anyway? I think these days, unless people use a lot of hot water, my advice generally would be to go with PV instead. But yeah, it really does depend on how much hot water you use. Okay.
Thank you, John. That was tremendously important. You packed a lot into your 20 minutes there. That was great. So thank you. If you want to,
okay.
Yeah, if people want to stop, if you want to stop sharing, there was a question in the chat. Will you be able to make your slides available like in PDF form afterwards? Would you be willing to do that? Or I mean,
I don't see why not. I don't think there's anything terribly confidential there. So yeah.
Okay. If you could give me a PDF. I mean, we are recording this, and I'll send the link to the recording out. But you know, we can send out a PDF of your slides as well. But thank you very much. We could just take one very quick question, but please, so if anybody wants to ask a question, please use the reactions at the bottom and put a hand up, because I can't see everybody, so I won't be able to see anybody waving. So if anybody does have a quick question for John, we will come back to that at the end. Jeremy White, do you want to unmute?
Hi, thanks very much, John. Very informative. You didn't mention the option of charging batteries from a cheap overnight tariff. Presumably that must be possible. Do the control systems easily allow you to switch from charging from a cheap overnight tariff, which is probably what you want to do in the winter, to charging from your PV, which is what you want to do in the summer?
Yeah, they do. Most of them are very good at telling you or letting you tell them when you want them to charge. So, for example, with the battery system we've got, you can tell it to charge between, say, 3 and 7 a.m. or something like that. What they're less good at is letting you tell them when to discharge. So what I would like to do personally, if I'm going to buy energy cheap overnight during the winter, is discharge it during the evening time of peak demand, because that's when it has most benefit for the grid. And yeah, quite often they won't let you specify the discharge time. I think Tesla Powerwall 2 system will, Tesla Powerwall 1 won't, and other batteries it varies from model to model. But yes, in general, that's a good thing. But with a 20-minute time limit, we couldn't really go into it much. Maybe discuss it more in a bit, perhaps.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, John. Okay, without further ado, we'll move on to our homeowners now. So Kevin is going to go first. So Kevin.
Yeah, I'll kick off. And just as far as that last question is concerned, I can actually cover that as well, because it's something I'm going to go into, sort of different charge rates. Lisa, thanks for inviting me. And John, that was fascinating. And yeah, Lisa, I did have a photograph, if you could, of my air source heat pump and panels. If you could sort of put that in, it'll be quite nice. But if you can't, don't worry. Oh, maybe you are going to show it. Okay, I will carry on. No, not the house one. Wait, right. Okay. Can everybody see that? Maybe, can you see that? In 2010, we bought a pretty grotty 60s bungalow and completely refurbished it, fully insulating it, insulation on the outside, and we installed an air source heat pump. Basically, we've had the air source heat pump running now for 14 years. Right, I'll just sort of close that. Right, if you could close that picture, Lisa, that'd be good. One thing which I felt was quite important, and perhaps you would have seen in the picture, is sort of visually what panels look like. And the latest panels are a dark color. And if you've got artificial slates like we had, they blend in completely with the roof. Some of the earlier panels are pretty ugly. Anyway, we in August 2022, we got prices for installing panels and batteries and an inverter. And yeah, the prices which came in were quite interesting, and I was quite interested in John's prices. I think possibly we got a fairly good deal. We got 14 panels and 15 kilowatts batteries, 3 batteries, which were Solis batteries, sorry, pure drive batteries, and a Solis inverter. And so we've got 14 panels at 400 watts each, 5.6 kilowatts, and the price which came in was 12,200, which was pretty good compared with all the other prices. We went for a large company, not a local company. Installation was by local people though, and it was very quick and very, very efficient. So the panels went up very, very quickly. What took probably the most time was putting up scaffolding at the side of the house. We did go for installing our batteries in our loft. But you know, John mentioned this about it being a problem. And again, I was quite conscious of the batteries sort of sticking out all around the house on the outside. And from conversation with the company that supplied, they didn't seem too concerned about the batteries being installed in the loft. The main issue which I had was each battery weighs 56 kilograms, so it had to be fixed to a wall. There's only one chap arrived to install the batteries. So they'd been installed and brought in a pallet, and I had to help. And we did set up a sort of rig and managed to get them up into the loft and secured to the wall, so they're not on a flooring. there was basically 3 engineers who came. There was an engineer who came to install the panels, another one came to install the batteries, and then I had another engineer who came around to install the app. And that's something which I'll go into. What you find is you get an app, and these things, if you're not very technical, can be complicated. And I think if you are buying a system, you really need to make sure there's good backup as far as programming this app, because if you don't get it right, you've got lots of problems and lots of heartache. One thing which you would take for granted is that you're going to be plugged into the national grid. You've got to apply to the national grid for installation. So if we're at the end of a drive, if all the other houses had solar panels, it's quite likely would have been refused, because the national grid wouldn't have coped, their cables wouldn't have coped with our additional panels. So that's something you have to apply for. Now, we use Octopus Energy, and we're on an Economy 7 tariff. So during the day, it's 26p per kilowatt hour, and at night it's 12 kilowatts per hour. Now, on the inverter, I've got to sort of grips with it now, but it's not instant. I can set the time that it charges. So essentially, I change that night. I use nighttime electricity in the winter, and not in the summer, but in the winter I charge up my batteries with the nighttime electricity, which makes so much sense at 12 kilowatts an 12 kilowatts an hour as opposed to 26p. But where I did have problems is what I found initially was that I would charge my batteries up, and the charging would stop at 7 o'clock, and virtually at 8 o'clock I'd find that electricity is being pumped back into the grid, despite setting the time as to when I want it to be pumped into the grid, which was later in the day. I think you sort of said in the evening, John, but I sort of went for sort of late afternoon. I eventually did resolve that problem, but I had to go through Solus and get their advice and get them to help. So that's just something to think about. I get 15p per kilowatt hour from Octopus, and I'm really quite happy with Octopus Energy. They also have a special air source heat pump rate, which I haven't actually used, but I'm quite happy with the system I've got. Currently, I'm paying about £150 a month average, and I think as John went into the summer months, we're pretty well self-sufficient as far as electricity is concerned. The air source heat pump is only heating the water, we don't have the heating on, and we are pretty well self-sufficient in terms of electricity. The winter months, though, we're down to about 5%. So, there is this average, but we do have a very small adjoining holiday let, sort of, it's one up, one down, and that is purely electricity. So effectively, we are running on this £150 a month average 2 properties, because that's all electric. What else was going to say? So, I mean, looking at my bills, and we are happy with it, we're probably saving about £900 a year, and which would give approximately a 13-year payback period. Now, there's obviously 2 issues. One is the reduction in carbon usage, which we are doing with the batteries and the solar panels. But the other income is through, if you haven't borrowed that money and you're putting it in the bank in terms of interest, it makes absolute sense to be investing your money in the solar panels and the money that you're saving. I think, as I mentioned, we're overall we're very pleased with the system. Probably what I would advise, as far as anybody, is to make sure they've got good backup. And these systems, you've got your batteries, you've got your inverter, and you get an app, and it really has to be set up very, very well. And unless you're a real, techno, then you need a little bit of technical support on the app. But it's very indicative, because you've got this app on your phone, and you can see immediately how much electricity you're generating, and you can see whether it's going into the house or it's going out to the grid. And no, it is quite addictive. So that's sort of about it in terms of my system. I would recommend getting prices and see what reviews are from people who've used different companies. And the company I went with, I'm very pleased with. And I did eventually get the backup I needed, which was good on the Solus inverter. I'm now very worried about having my batteries in the loft, but after over 2 years they've been fine. So yeah, we'll stick with where they are. So yeah, and somebody had a question, I think.
I think we'll move on, Kevin, because
Okay,
we're
right.
behind time. But
Yeah.
we'll come back to questions later. Thank you. That was brilliant. And just mention you're in Worksmith. Our next homeowner is Tracy from Chesterfield.
Hi, thanks, Lisa, and thanks for that. There's quite a few things that I'm hearing that I might be repeating, so hopefully that just reinforces some of the benefits. So if I explain a bit about our system, we had it installed in 2021. We live in a 4-bedroomed detached house with a big south-facing roof. So we've had 12 panels installed on that roof and made the most of that space up there. So we'd been considering solar for quite a while, but because we were out at work a lot of the time, it didn't really work for us until the battery option was introduced, and the option to save the solar energy on the battery during the day. I've got a couple of recommendations in terms of the research that we did. We used the Energy Saving Trust solar calculator just to look at our house and what we would be able to generate, and it gave some quite good figures for us to work off when we were talking to some of the different suppliers. And also Which magazine did a good checklist, so when people were coming around and quoting, that was quite useful for us to work through and make sure we'd asked all the right questions. So we did get a few quotes and picked our supplier, who I have to say I wouldn't particularly recommend in terms of the time it took to install. I think we got the right advice about the system that we've got, and we are happy with that system, and we've had good backup in terms of the app once it was installed, but it did take a long time to get all the different component parts installed. They weren't particularly well organised. So my advice there is just to check the reviews and really carefully when you're picking your supplier. So the system that we've got is the 12 panels, as I've mentioned, that's 4.2 kilowatts, and then an inverter and an 8.2 kilowatt hour battery, and that's a Give Energy battery. And then we've also got a car charge point on the side of the house, and that's a My Energy Zappy car charger. So all look very similar to the photos that John shared earlier. So the size of it, the panels take up most of our roof space. As I've said, the battery and the inverter are in our garage and no bigger than the size of a suitcase, so kind of slotted quite nicely on the side of the garage wall. And then the car charger we could position where it suited us to park the car and charge it on the drive. The cost altogether, we didn't get any grants available at that time, so we paid just under 10,000 altogether for that whole system. Once it was installed, I think this has been mentioned, but you get a certificate that enables you to register for the Smart Export Guarantee. So there's quite a bit of paperwork, which also I think with hindsight, I'd have been more informed about what paperwork we should have been chasing up for, because that took a little while to come through, and that perhaps stopped us from accessing some of the tariffs straight away. The tariff is the big benefit for us really with this, and I think that's where we get a lot of the additional financial benefits. So we're with Octopus as well. It's a tariff called Intelligent Go, which my husband's not sure whether that's available anymore. But as Kevin said, that gives us a discounted rate at night. We only pay 7p at night per kilowatt hour. But during the day it would be much more expensive. But during the day we're using solar power or battery power, so we're not really accessing the grid at all during the day. During the night we'll charge the car and recharge the battery on the cheap power from the grid. So some of the benefit we're getting is through just the battery and the grid rather than the solar, but the fact that we've got solar gives us access to that tariff. And we've got the Give Energy app, so that gives us all the kind of bar charts like John shared, so you can see exactly what's being generated hour by hour really, and where your power's coming from. So the benefits to us, it allows us to store the energy for use in the evening. So because we're out of the house during the day, we get a lot of benefit then from the solar, and access to the cheap power at night. We're also benefiting more now because the selling back to the grid is more beneficial now than when we first had the system installed. So I think 3 years ago, you weren't really getting very much from selling power back to the grid, but now we get 15p per kilowatt hour. So it actually makes more sense to sell what we generate during the day and then charge the battery up on the cheap power at night. So you can adjust what's going on, and my husband uses the app to kind of adjust what we're using from the battery and the solar. So just as an example, we looked at last Saturday, we used nothing at all from the grid all day. We used 16 kilowatt hours total through the day. 4 of those were charging the car. 10 of that came from the battery, and 2 came directly from solar. So we sold 2 kilowatt hours back to the grid on Saturday because it was a nice sunny day. So obviously it fluctuates throughout the year, and in the winter we're paying more for grid energy. I did have a look at some of the bills as well. Our average bill across the year was £43 a month. The most expensive was around £100 a month in December and January. And then in May and June, we paid next to nothing for our energy, for our electricity. So in 2023, we spent a total of £514 on our electricity. So I think it is difficult to estimate the overall benefits because power has fluctuated in cost so much over the last few years. Also, we get the benefit of charging the car, and the petrol costs have fluctuated so much over the years, so it's been quite hard to estimate our overall benefit. But we think the original estimate was that we would get a return on our investment within 8 to 10 years, but we think that's come down to 5 to 6 years because of the rise in energy costs. So for us, it's definitely been a good decision to get that. We'll start to see the benefits quite soon. And yeah, just a really good, well-run system. So happy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tracy. That's great. You know, in end of October, and you're not using any energy from the grid during the day. You know, fantastic. Okay, we'll move on to our last homeowner now, Peter Robinson. If you'd like to. I've lost Peter on this. Oh, there you are, Peter. Go on then.
Okay. Hello. I've come from a rather different position. Firstly, I'm lazy, so I don't want to do all the analysis and all the calculations. I just want it to run. But also the real driver was I switched to air source heat pump, and my electricity bills went up enormously. I'm not saying I'm very well insulated, very efficient, but they went up. You know, so I went. And I was thinking of just putting in solar panels, but at the time it wasn't very efficient. Although over the years, the argument is that they've become much more efficient, and I think it's much more worthy. I looked at getting solar panels and a battery, talked to John and others. We're talking about roughly about £10,000. However, I came across a firm called Tomato Energy, where they would put in the solar panels, they would put in the battery, they would guarantee the electricity price, and I don't have to do, and they put in their apps and everything like that. And that's what they did. They rent my roof. So I've got 9 panels. I've got a very large battery. It's outside and the inverter's outside. I didn't pay them anything for this gear. What I have done is I've reduced my electricity bill by about 2/3. And that I'm paying that for the next 10 years. After and now there's a problem about that, and they do all the thinking, you know, when it goes into the grid and so on, all the calculations. I can see it in an app. To be honest, as I told you, I'm lazy. I haven't looked at it since day one. I've just allowing them to manage it. There are disadvantages to this. One is if I die or if I move, the gear is still here and it has to be passed on to somebody else. That's possible, or we can buy it back, and they've offered it. They've priced it about £9,000. If after half my 10 years, I can buy it back for 4,500, and I can run it and administer it myself. So, as I've said, I'm saving a lot of money on electricity. I find it a relief, and I'm sure I could have done it other ways and stuff like that, but this is the way that I've pursued my adventure. That's it.
Hey, thank you, Peter. So that's another alternative way of doing it without any upfront costs, but obviously maybe fewer benefits in the long run, but certainly a good option. Okay, we'll just have one last quick presentation from Pete at March's Energy Agency. He's just going to do a couple of slides on the retrofit project. So Pete, and then we'll move on to a general Q&A.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, so I won't linger. I think a few of you have seen this already, so I won't dwell too long. I'll share a few slides. Hopefully that's visible.
Yeah, can see that.
Great. Okay. I'm actually going to start with the last slide of my series, just because I think it's quite relevant. A couple of events coming up. Just thought it might be useful for people in the room today. On Thursday, if anybody lives up in the very north end of the county, up near Dronfield, we've got a workshop or an event that we're putting on there, where you could come along to the Peel Centre in Dronfield. We're going to just outline the project that I'm running, and we're doing at MEA around home energy surveys, home surveys. But also we'll have some installers, some air source heat pump installers and manufacturers. I think we've got Dakin and Valand coming along, I think. We've also got PV installer, and we're looking. We've got the conservation officer as well coming along. So particularly useful if anyone's in the older building and wants to know what they can actually are allowed to do. So that could be interesting if people, if you're in Chesterfield or up that way. And the second one, online thing towards the end of November on the 25th. How to retrofit done well, and this is about how to manage installers. So if you're getting panels on the roof, what are the sorts of questions you like to ask? What should you think about in advance of them turning up at your doorstep? It's being done by a guy called Nick Parsons, as some of you might well know. Really rated. He's a great presenter, really enthusiastic, and you can book on that at the Eventbrite link. So I'm trying to stick that in the chat. So yeah, that's the event. So just to very briefly touch on this project that I'm talking about, we're looking at focusing some support for homeowners, primarily in harder to treat properties. So if you're struggling to kind of understand what you could do you've got an off-gas grid or home, or you're in a conservation area, or just hard to heat home, you're eligible really for one of our surveys. They're free, quite technical surveys. They're PAS 2035 sort of style things, which you may or know what that means. It's a sort of standard home survey protocol, if you like, and in which we will condense that into a friendly report for you to understand what all the techie data is trying to tell you. So help you to prioritize what you might do. Is solar panels the best thing to do, best thing to invest in up front, or do you want to maybe concentrate on other things first, or whatever the message might be, really. So it can be really useful. These things are valued about £600 or so each, generally. So it's a good deal. It's not going to cost you anything. There's no buys, no catches. We're not going to try and sell you anything off the back of it. So if you do want to look at that, you could that QR code there to go through to the application form on the website, and that's it. I will paste those links into the chat. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Pete. And it's well worth going to hear Nick Parsons. And I think installers is always an issue, I think, for a lot of people. Present company accepted, John, there. Okay, so we've got about half an hour left. Well, maybe a bit more than half an hour. We are going to finish at 8:30. So now's the time for Q&A. And as I said before, if you'd like to use the reactions at the bottom of the screen, and you can raise your hand. And also just to say thank you to Mohammed, who's also got a solar project, and he's put some information in the chat there. And he said his bill became 0 from the day they installed it, which is pretty amazing. I think all of the homeowners we've heard from today are pretty happy with their system. So okay, sorry, I didn't see whose hand was first, but sorry, I'll take Valerie first and then Tim. Valerie, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, thank you. I have a 1930s bungalow, slate roof, the original roof, with thankfully the roof facing in the right direction to put PV panels on. But I also have spray-on insulation directly onto the slates. Has anybody, I mean, first of all, finding people who will work on a slate roof is not always easy. And if you have a slate roof, Octopus won't go near it with their scheme. But has anybody come across a company who is willing to work with a roof with that insulation on the inside of the slate roof?
Thanks, Valerie. Possibly one for John. John, are you able to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, slate roofs we do routinely. They need a slightly different type of hook to attach the rails onto the roof, but that's all off-the-shelf parts that good reputable companies like Schletter make. The difficulty is more with that foam insulation. I think that would make us really quite nervous. And if you do the sort of PAS 2035 retrofit coordinator training, for example, they will highlight a lot of problems that you can have with that kind of insulation. So I would get professional advice about that. I think it's quite a tricky one. So I think it will make it more difficult, and I would get advice about that insulation anyway.
I'm pretty okay with the insulation in that it's properly ventilated, unlike some of the insulation that got put in that is now causing people to have problems with, selling properties. I found a company who has given me a really good quote to do the work, but where they will want to attach to the roof, I've got to arrange to have the insulation moved. On the inside.
I mean, I think the issue is that normally you would need to lift some slates, and if they're stuck down to the polyurethane foam, I assume that's what it probably is, then there's always going to be a risk of cracking them. So you probably want to remove the insulation rather than just sort of pulling them and breaking them. So I can imagine that it would be quite a tricky thing. I mean, if you can work with the insulation installers as well as the solar installers, and they're willing to work together, that will probably be the best way of tackling it.
Thank you. Thanks, Valerie. Thanks, John. Tim, would you like to unmute?
Yes. Hello. I've started a route towards solar, but it was accidental really, because we're doing a massive installation of better insulation on our roof. And because we're going to end up taking the slates off or the tiles off, we've decided that we really got to put solar in now, even though we are not ready yet to move away from gas entirely. And for that reason, I've done a lot of research, and there's just quite a few observations really about where I've got to with costs, particularly because I'm looking more than anybody about trying to minimize them. And I really tried to get installers to come and give me what I thought was sensible prices. But as people are saying, with batteries, it's kind of 9, 10, 11, 12, 13,000 pounds, and I couldn't justify that. And the reason that's really triggered me into doing a DIY solar PV, which we're going to do in January, February, is simply because I found out what the real cost of the equipment is. And so, for an example, a 16 amp inverter, which is a sort of standard that you could put onto the grid without even having to ask until you've actually put it in place, they're about £700 plus VAT. And a 10 kilowatt hour battery, a Dynest battery, is about 1,200 quid plus VAT. And the solar panels themselves are so cheap now, they're coming in at between 10 and 11 pence per watt. So £50 for a solar panel. And my installers are putting huge margins on these, and therefore coming up to these large numbers like 10, 11, 12,000 pounds. Now, there are a couple of problems, and with doing a DIY, and just to make people aware, the first one is that you may not be able to get the VAT back, because you may not be able to recover it if your your electrician or whoever might be doing a final connection may not be VAT registered. But the overall starting cost is not going to kill you even with 20% VAT on it. And the other thing that stopped people doing this in the past has been that you've not been able to get paid by the grid, by the supply companies, if you were not getting an installation done by an MCS registered installer. But Octopus blew that out of the water last year, and they've started to allow non-MCS approved installations to be given SEG payments, as long as you provided the paperwork. And one of the paperwork items you need is the permission from National Grid or whoever your DNO is, which they'll do anyway without asking who's doing the installation. And then you have to get your connection onto into your house CV as consumer unit, signed off under Part P of the building regs. And most electricians are self-certified for that anyway. But
sorry, Tim. Is there a question, or did you just want to?
It's an observation, really, about
just an observation. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and I finished really. That there's just a big issue about the costs of doing this, and it isn't as high as it appears to be. But you have to do your homework, and you don't have to pay these massive amounts. You can probably halve that cost. But even then, there are trip-ups, like the people who do Derbyshire Dales sign off for electricity for Part P, which is the Derbyshire Building Control Partnership. They are trying to charge £600 to do the equivalent work that an electrician might do if he self-certifies. So my sort of observation is, just to fill in some things that were missing really from my own research, was it doesn't have to be as expensive. You can get the return a bit quicker than you might have otherwise thought. And all the fences that used to be around don't appear to be there now. And so it's really an open, it's more open than it ever was, I think, to put solar power PV on your roof. And that's what I'm going to be doing in 2 months' time.
Okay, interesting. Good luck with that. Thank you for that. I mean, John might want to say something. Kevin, sorry, Zizi, I know you were first, but Kevin, did you want to come back on something else, or was it a separate question?
It's a separate question.
Okay, I'll take Zizi's first then.
But also, I was going to say, I think Tim's probably right, but there are huge issues and how capable you are, and obviously safety issues going up onto a roof. and you can do a lot of damage if you aren't you aren't professionally trained in how to go up on a roof. And so it's not, I'm quite practical, but I wouldn't like to do it.
Well, I was just going to say, I do have a roofer re-roofing my house, so
Oh well, you're fine. Yeah. My question very quickly was for Tracy.
Sorry, Kevin, can I just go to ZZ first, because she had a hand up first, and then
All
I'll
right,
come
sorry.
back to you. Okay, sorry, ZZ.
Yes, in the original presentation by John, he said that you need an inverter, obviously, from your solar panels to AC electricity. And if you have a battery, you'd need another inverter to go from AC back to DC for the battery. But is it possible to get your solar to go straight into the battery without, because you lose each time you do go through an inverter? And so it would seem a no-brainer to, if you're going to charge your battery mainly from the solar, to do it directly.
Yeah, there are some benefits that you can get with the hybrid inverters. They can be a few percent more efficient because they can do DC to DC conversion between the panels and the batteries. But there probably isn't time to go into all the pros and cons of the different systems, but it doesn't really make a big difference. So I'm quite happy to install systems either way, really. I guess the problem might be the string voltage on a bunch of PV panels could be several hundred volts, and the battery voltage might be 48. So you need to do some sort of conversion, even if they're all DC. So the sort of inefficiency that's caused by converting from DC to AC as well isn't that great. As I say, it's only a few percent. So there's a slight advantage to be had, but that's already incorporated into the hybrid systems.
Oh, well, thank you. I didn't realize that. And thanks also to the previous man who's doing it all himself. That was really interesting, I found.
John, did you have any comment on what Tim was saying?
Yeah, I mean, I started off, making my own solar thermal collectors many years ago. And if you've got the skills to do it yourself, that's great. And there have been a lot of barriers. And if you've got all the equipment you need and you're quite happy, getting the scaffolding up and doing all that stuff, that's great. Do it. You've got a great skill set there, and all power to your elbow, really. I agree completely that the regulatory barriers that we've had to put up with have been just a real pain. I know good people who've left the industry because of the amount of paperwork and bureaucracy that they were expected to go through to be MCS compliant, for example. I suppose what I would say is if you've got the overheads of having a van, having an industrial unit, and so on and so forth, your costs mount up. So if you are doing it as a business, you will have significantly higher costs than if you do it yourself. And that to some degree accounts for the price. But also nobody wants to work for nothing. And I'd have to say our profit margins aren't really huge when you add up all of our costs. So if you can do it yourself, that's great. But I don't know whether there's going to be a massive price drop because you can get all the parts more cheaply. The parts are only, one bit of the story in terms of where the costs come from.
Thanks, John. That's useful. Kevin, I'll come back to you. Yeah.
I've just got a question for Tracy, and I'm really envious with her figures in terms of her monthly costs as far as electricity. And my query is, do you have an air source heat pump or do you have gas heating?
Gas heating. It's gas heating.
Yeah, so that is the difference. And it's not part of this discussion, but air source heat pumps are, in terms of electricity, aren't necessarily that cheap to run. And this is something I've found. And that's obviously the difference in terms of my £140, £50 a month covers everything, which so we don't have gas, but yeah. The air source heat pump is not proving to be that cost effective in terms of electrical usage.
Thanks, Kevin. Can I just make a comment on that? Because we've got an air source heat pump and solar panels. We don't have a battery, but when we switched to a heat pump, because we've got solar, our energy costs went down very slightly. I think if we didn't have the solar, it would be a lot more expensive, because obviously electricity is more expensive. But I think because we've got the free electricity from the solar during the sort of shoulder months, we actually found it was cheaper than with a gas boiler.
Just on that, it may be our air source heat pump is now 14 years old. It's probably not as efficient as some of the ones which are coming out now. So yeah, that's probably the difference.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? Put your hands up. Zizi, you've got another question.
It's not really a question, it's commenting on that discussion about air source heat pumps, whether they're cheaper or not. Because they dissipate energy at a gentle level, the amount of insulation you've got makes an enormous difference. If you've got a energy performance certificate of D to G, you're going to be losing the heat as fast as you put it out in your room. If you're well insulated, it can be significantly cheaper than a gas central heating. So
I hear, yeah,
still expensive. Try and see what insulation you could add.
We're a B in terms of our EPC. We completely enveloped our pretty sort of poor bungalow with external insulation, underfloor insulation, roof insulation, and interestingly, the engineer from the battery company who installed the batteries, he was monitoring our electrical usage, and he was shocked by the sharp rises in electricity when the air source heat pump went on. And I think it's probably due to the fact that it's a 14-year-old air source heat pump. It's Mitsubishi. It works very well, but they aren't necessarily that cheap to run.
Oh, you're right, that some of the modern ones have a COP that's much higher.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Zizi. Yeah, no, it's a good point, Zizi, about insulation. And Kevin, you're an early pioneer, obviously.
Yeah.
So, but you've benefited for 14 years. Jeremy, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to the other presenters as well. So I noticed both Kevin and Tracy had panels and battery installed at the same time. So I'm wondering, we've got 4 kilowatts of solar panels. They've been there for 11 years, and I benefit from the feed-in tariff. And my question is whether, if we had a battery installed, would we then lose the benefit of the feed-in tariff? Because I'm just slightly bemused by this concept of selling power back into the grid. If you can store it in a battery and use it yourself, why would you bother to sell it back into the grid? So, John, what are the rules there? Would we lose the feed-in tariff? Do you know?
No, you wouldn't lose. You wouldn't lose it. You can add a battery without disturbing your existing PV and inverter system. You could also change into a hybrid inverter if you were replacing your inverter anyway, but that gets more complicated because if you charge your battery from the grid as well as charging it from the PV system, you need to subtract the energy that you're getting from the grid when you're working out how much energy you've generated for the purposes of the feed-in tariff. So my personal preference would be to leave what you've got completely undisturbed and just add a battery system as a sort of standalone unit, but it can be done either way.
Okay, and then why then sell electricity back into the grid? I mean, I'm not quite sure the logic of charging up your battery and selling it back rather than just using it.
Well, you wouldn't necessarily. I mean, I suppose depending on the tariff structure, it might be advantageous to sell energy from your battery back to the grid, and some people will do
Buy
that.
it cheap and sell it expensive.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You buy it cheap and sell it expensive.
Yeah.
I
And
see.
you know,
My understanding is that the energy companies are trying to smooth out demand, aren't they? So they would buy our power from us during the day at a higher rate than they'll sell it to us at night. So we take advantage of that.
Yeah, okay. And then since I've got the floor, I'm slightly anxious about the talk of apps and the complicated apps. I've previously had experience of an internet connected heating system, which was a pain in the arse, to put it mildly. Are there any battery systems that aren't linked up to an app that you can actually see what you're doing on the control panel fixed to your wall without having to worry about internet connection and all that palaver?
I'd just say, I could come in there. You don't have to actually use the app. You can go up to the inverter and do all the changes to the storage and you know, everything actually on the inverter. But as our system is up in the loft, it's a bit of a nuisance. So it's much easier just to do it on the phone. So you don't have to actually have the app.
That may be true with Solus, but it wouldn't be true, for example, with Tesla. So, and probably not with Give Energy, I would guess. So, yeah, I think we have occasionally had people who really don't want an app or internet connections, and I completely understand that. They can be a pain, but the number of systems which will allow you to commission without an internet connection is reducing over time. The other thing that we've come across is situations where you might get a 2-year warranty if you don't have an internet connection, and perhaps a 7-year warranty if you do. So yeah, you probably want the internet connection in those circumstances, and that applies to heat pumps and things as well.
Thanks, John. Tim, I have seen your hand up, but I just wanted to ask Tracy, because I think your app is very easy to use, isn't it? Or is it just you've got a husband that's very good at using apps?
I've got a husband who's very easy.
Okay.
Yes, he does most of it, to be fair, but I've looked, it's on the internet as well, so I prefer it on the laptop actually, because I can see more on a bigger screen, so you can access it that way and see what's going on as well. I think what complicates it for us is also the Zappi car charger has a separate set of controls that you can again use your phone to work out when the car is going to take its charge through the night and balance that alongside the battery charging. So there's that bit of controlling going on as well. I think it would be more straightforward if it was just straightforward solar and battery.
Yeah, or go for something like Peter Robinson's got. Sorry, Tim, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, it was just to say I've got this dangerous position of doing lots of research because we're nearly ready to push the button. And because I won't be able to use everything I generate, and because I applied for a thing called a G99 and got a 7 kilowatt allowance back onto the grid just a couple of weeks ago, I've been looking at these other tariffs. And the thing that Tracy said about balancing the grid, it seems to be becoming even more important now. And I think there's a tariff called Octopus Agile or something, where the price of the power either coming into you or being exported is hugely different. And I think some of the most prohibitive import rates around the end of the afternoon, early evening, can be something like 69p if you were to buy it. But then the the import rates in the middle of the night can be something negative, like -1 or -2. So you're being paid to take electricity from the grid, which is amazing, and again will help on with the feedback. With the return on the investment that you make if like me you are going to go and spend the money. So it was just these incredible tariffs, but they're so complicated. It's probably a bit like day trading on shares or something. You could drive yourself insane. But I think there are some clever bits of software sitting in the inverters now where they actually download the grid of how much these unit prices are per half an hour, and they do it for you. That's what I'm hoping, because I don't want to sit here all day long trying to work out when's a good time to import and when's a good time to export, when it gets complicated and is harder than just a few hours at night or whatever.
Oh, so there's an app to use your app, is it? Is that the... Okay, any more questions out there? Are we people had got all the information they need tonight? That's fine. We can finish a bit early if that's the case. So if there are, oh, sorry.
I was going to say there are a few other things I could comment on if that's useful.
Sure. Yeah. If you want to say a few more words.
Okay. I mean, I guess first of all, I think in terms of this question about PV and lofts, I think there has now been guidance released saying that it's not a good idea to put your batteries or the battery part of the system in a loft. And I think there is a view that might turn into regulations at some point. So I would ask your potential installers very carefully what they think about that and get the latest information on it. I think one of the things where we're talking about these fancy tariffs is these days, some of the inverters, notably from Give Energy, but other manufacturers are starting to do it, will come with stickers saying they're Octopus ready. So I think the thinking is that the inverter manufacturers and companies like Octopus will get together and jointly manage the best use of your system. You've always got to ask yourself the question, from whose point of view is it going to be the best use? Will you be basically serving Octopus as a sort of profit objectives or your own? But this is something which increasingly you'll probably find comes built into the systems. I think on the subject of tariffs, the Octopus rates are very interesting and there's a huge range of them. I think where they do offer occasionally negative prices, I don't think they will necessarily do that routinely. And the number of days per year where you can get negative prices may not be terribly great. So think carefully about that when you're choosing the tariff. And what I would try and do, if you can, is look at historical record of what the prices have been and see whether you think it's really worth it. The other one to look at is the Octopus heat pump tariff. Now, I think ZZ commented that heat pumps tend to run gently, but presumably most of the time. And I think the Octopus heat pump tariff from memory gives you 3 hours quite cheap in the middle of the night, 3 hours quite cheap in the middle of the afternoon. The rest of the day, it's about average, except during the early evening, at which point it's diabolically expensive. So if you imagine a situation where the children come back home from school, switch on all the lights, all the computers, all the TVs, and then you cook your meal with an electric cooker, you may find that the Octopus heat pump tariff is not necessarily what you will benefit from hugely. So think carefully about the Octopus heat pump tariff in particular. So yeah, a few things to consider there, I think. Okay, any other questions?
That's really helpful, John. Thank you. There's been some really excellent advice and information this evening. So I was just going to say a couple of points before we finish. So the three homeowners and plus another one, Brian, who's in Homegate. So Tracy's in Chesterfield, Kevin's in Wirksworth, and Peter's in Derby. They are willing to have visits or answer questions. So if anybody is interested, get in touch with me. You've all got my email. I emailed out the Zoom link to you earlier today. So if you do want to get in touch with any of the homeowners, if you've got any questions for them, get in touch with me. And also, if anybody's interested in signing up onto the Transition Chesterfield mailing list and getting our monthly newsletter, again, contact me and I can add you. There's also a Derbyshire and Derby Climate Coalition mailing list. If you're interested in getting onto that mailing list, please contact Peter Robinson, and if Peter could put his email address in the chat, that would be great. And Peter has also posted some information about a COP event being held in Derby on Saturday the 23rd. So if you scroll up in the chat, you'll see some information about that event. So if there are no more questions, I think we'll finish here. I think everybody's probably had a long day. So just a big thank you to all our presenters, John, Kevin, Tracy, Peter and Peter. If you could show your appreciation in the reactions, there's a little clapping hands, or you can do the Nord, but absolutely fantastic presentations, and thank you for giving up your time. And thanks to everybody who asked questions. Thanks for all the supporting organisations. Thanks to my colleague Carl for some tech support. And yeah, so this event was organised by Transition Chesterfield. And thank you, everybody, and have a good evening. I'll stop the recording now.
Thank you, Lisa.